Hello, everyone. My name is Siobhán Wills, and I'm the director of the Transitional Justice Institute. You're warmly welcome to this talk by the UN Special Rapporteur on protecting and promoting human rights while countering terrorism, Professor Ben Saul. Professor Saul is also Chalice Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney and an elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. He was the Gough, Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Visiting Professor of Australian Studies at Harvard University, and in 2019 was a former Associate Fellow of Chatham House in London and of the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague. He has authored and edited numerous books, including The Oxford Guide to International Humanitarian Law, co-edited with Dapo Akandi in 2020, and a textbook on public international law, published with Cambridge University Press in 2023. Professor Saul is here today to address the human rights impacts of Israel's campaign of violence in Palestine and neighboring states in response to the violent attack on Israel by Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, and subsequent attacks on Israel by other armed groups. A ceasefire took effect in Gaza on 19th of January 2025, but the legacy of harm in both Palestine and Israel and the structural causes of the violence remain to be addressed. The chat will remain closed during Professor Saul's presentation. Afterwards, there will be an opportunity for questions to be posed via the chat. Thank you also to Saman for interpreting. Professor Saul, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. It is an honor. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Siobhán, and good morning from the future here in Sydney, Australia on Thursday morning. Really delighted to be here with you to talk about this a problem which has been around for at least 100 years in the Middle East. I'm the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism. I've been in this job for about a year and a bit now. I cover 193 countries, so I can't proclaim to be a Palestine-Israel specialist particularly. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Palestinian, but I do have a profound interest in ensuring the proper application of international law and its enforcement to all states while countering terrorism. In my mandate, as you know, there's no definition internationally accepted of terrorism or who is a terrorist group. But for the purpose of my human rights mandate, whenever a particular country calls somebody or calls a group terrorist, whether objectively they should be called that or not, it attracts my mandate. So if you call Hezbollah or Hamas or other armed groups terrorist, then I have a mandate to monitor compliance with human rights and relatedly humanitarian law, international criminal law, and other bits of applicable international law. So the last year has been particularly busy. It's not just Israel and Palestine, but the surrounding area, because of course Israel has used force on the pretext of countering terrorism in a whole range of neighboring countries, including Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen. It also engages the conduct of third states, because as you know, many countries have been, well, a significant number of countries have been providing weapons and munitions to Israel, despite its conduct in Palestine. So look, today I'm not going to obviously cover every aspect of this very complex series of conflicts in the region, which are interrelated. But I do want to address some particularly pressing current issues which have arisen and have been keeping us busy in recent weeks. The first one is so let me start with the change of presidency in the United States and the profound shift in United States foreign policy towards the region. Well, profound shift, but also obviously continuity in terms of the degree of ongoing support for Israel, but the acceleration of that support under President Trump. So last week, of course, Trump shockingly declared the US will take over and own Gaza, to use his words, to transform it into the Riviera of the Middle East. He wants to permanently relocate Palestinians from Gaza to some, quote, beautiful area with homes and safety. And he seems to have nominated Egypt and Jordan and is pressuring them to take Palestinians. He then redeveloped Gaza with the world's people, as he put it, whatever that means. Now, look, early on, it wasn't clear if this vague plan is a thought bubble, a kind of wishful real estate scheme, a ploy to extract concessions, or he means it. I mean, already he has done the unthinkable domestically on many fronts in his first month in office. And many countries are taking this very seriously indeed. And you may have seen just overnight the U.S. Secretary of State has publicly said to Ukraine that Ukraine can't expect to keep its own sovereign territory, and that the U.S., is interested in doing a deal to give an aggressor a bit of someone else's land. So this is a retreat, I think, across the board. It's not limited to Palestine, although I think it's particularly aggravated in the case of Palestine. A retreat across the board from the basic international rules which have governed, or which we say have governed, the international order of the last 75 years or so. Now, President Trump expressed concern about Palestinian suffering. He called Gaza a hellhole. He recognizes the need for massive reconstruction of what he calls a demolition site, but his proposal would shatter the fundamental rules of international order since 1945, which the US, by the way, was instrumental in creating to restore peace after the catastrophic World War, which killed over 80 million people. Under international law, Palestinians have the right of self-determination, and we know that freely empowers them to choose their own political future. There's nothing stopping Palestinians choosing through some kind of vote or referendum to become a sovereign part of the United States. But that's not what they want. And Trump has not suggested they would have a choice. So in the absence of any Palestinian consent, a US takeover would be a violation of the prohibition on the use of military force under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, on the prohibition on the annexation of foreign territory by force, which Israel has already attempted to do elsewhere. And the violation of these rules and self-determination replaces the international rule of law with and the peace and stability it was designed to offer in 1945 with the rule of the survival of the strongest. And this fits with the US president's worldview as a kind of new American strongman. Now, the rules were designed to stop predatory countries from violently seizing and colonizing foreign lands and subjugating their populations. We know that inevitably results in protracted violent resistance and grave human rights violations, and it tends to endanger regional and often world peace as well. The United States would simply replace Israel as the unlawful occupier of Gaza. And if the president is so concerned about peace, it's not clear why he thinks a US occupation would bring peace when over half a century of Israeli occupation has brought perpetual war and death to Palestinians and Israelis alike. It would simply deepen the violence and spread it across borders. Other recent US interventions did not go well. If you think of 2 decades of US intervention in Afghanistan, which ultimately resulted in a Taliban victory. A decade of US presence in Iraq provoked an extraordinary insurgency and probably led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Trump's play for Gaza is part of a pattern of predation, including ambitions for Greenland and the Panama Canal. He has form from his previous presidency because, of course, then he illegally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem. And you remember he moved the embassy there, as well as, by the way, Israel's annexation of Syria's Golan Heights. Of course, in recent months, Israel has taken more of the Golan Heights across the buffer zone in breach of a ceasefire agreement. He also recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco's recognition of Israel, part of his Arab normalization strategy. Now, Trump's proposal to relocate Palestinians, if it were without their consent, would constitute the war crime of forcibly displacing the population of occupied territory. This is a tactic which was honed by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Ethnic cleansing is not a legal term, but it absolutely describes the plan quite well. It would accelerate the continuous forced displacement of Palestinians since the Nakba in 1947, 1948, manifest in recent decades and still today in extensive home demolitions, evictions, and the criminal building of illegal Israeli colonial settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Now, most Palestinians and Jordan and Egypt clearly oppose his resettlement plan. Jordan already hosts about 2.3 million Palestinian refugees. That's half of its population. And if Trump is, really so concerned about the plight of Gazans, he should pursue durable solutions in accordance with international refugee law. I'll come to UNRWA in a moment, but it is clear that with recent Israeli moves to legally cease cooperation with UNRWA, that the protection of Palestinian refugees by UNRWA in Palestine is in the process of effectively ceasing. What that means, of course, under refugee law is that Palestinians in those areas revert by virtue of the Refugee Convention to ordinary refugees under international refugee law. That gives UNHCR a mandate to protect them, but it also activates the principle of durable solutions, which have three kinds. One is you can, and all of these are voluntary, by the way. One, you get to stay where you are, so Palestinians can choose to stay in Gaza or the West Bank. Two, you get to return to your place of origin, which is Israel. So if Trump is concerned about the hellhole in Gaza, then he should pressure Israel to respect the right of return of people who were forced to flee their own country through many generations. And about 75% of Palestinian refugees originally lived in the territory now sovereign Israel. Or thirdly, voluntary third country resettlement. And of course, one of the countries with the greatest capacity to resettle immigrants is the United States. So if his concern about Palestinian welfare is genuine, he could always open pathways and green cards for migrants, refugees to come to the United States. Likewise, if the president is so concerned Gaza is an uninhabitable wasteland, he should instead contribute generously to the roughly $80 billion it's estimated to cost Palestinians to rebuild Gaza. He should pressure Israel to compensate Gazans for the many violations of humanitarian law committed during the war. I'll come back to violations of humanitarian law a little bit later. He should stop shipping US weapons and munitions to Israel that have been so often used to violate humanitarian law in Israeli attacks, and which have laid waste to much of Gaza, including making most of its population homeless. And I'll come back to arms transfers in a moment as well. But of course, instead, quite apart from this latest scheme, Trump has banned all funding to the UN Relief Agency for Palestine, UNRWA, which the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the UN Secretary General in the last year have all insisted is indispensable to humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza, and not just humanitarian relief, by the way, because UNRWA provides many other essential services, healthcare, education, in comparatively normal times in Gaza before the present conflict, as well as in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And all of those bodies have indicated that there is no other organization with the capacity, the expertise, the personnel, the networks to provide those services on the scale needed if there is an immediate cessation of Israeli cooperation with UNRWA, which came into effect earlier this week. So this week, the two Israeli laws which number one, bans UNRWA operations within sovereign Israel, which Israel, of course, claims to include annexed East Jerusalem. And secondly, prohibits all Israeli cooperation with UNRWA. So Israeli officials can't give them visas, can't coordinate on military operations to ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, etc. And it's not just the impact on UNRWA. Of course, UNRWA is a coordinator of all kinds of other actors, UN agencies and other partners who also provide humanitarian relief in the territory. So it has an amplified effect across the whole humanitarian system. President Trump has also, of course, gutted US aid, the US Development Agency, whose mission to combat poverty and human rights violations globally, including in the Middle East, precisely helps to prevent political violence. This is a point I want to emphasize because it's a point made in 1945 in Article 55 of the United Nations Charter, which says if you don't promote economic and social development, and if you don't respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, then you do not have the conditions for lasting peace and stability in the world. So aid and development money and projects are not just about fulfilling economic and social rights, as vital as that is for human dignity. It's also that these are also essential preconditions of security as well. And in my own mandate, a recent version of this idea is found in the 2006 Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which has a whole pillar, one of four pillars in the strategy devoted to what are called this is UN jargon, what are called the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, which is essentially trying to identify, loosely speaking, what are the root causes of political violence, terrorism around the place. And it goes on to give a long list of things, which include, obviously, state violations of human rights, poverty and inequality, political exclusion and marginalization, protracted unresolved conflict. And all of these things can fuel grievances, which it's not automatic. There's no necessary causation, but we absolutely know in many contexts, these are factors which are drivers of what some states will call terrorism, violent extremism, etc. Historically, we just called these usually armed groups fighting in armed conflict. But the point about this is unless you address those causes, you're not going to stop terrorist violence. They're in most places. There's quite a bit of empirical research on this. In most places, you cannot stop terrorism just by killing terrorists in war or arresting large numbers of them. And I think the present campaign in Gaza demonstrates that very well. I mean, this is the most powerful military, clearly, in the Middle East, with the support of the global superpower and all the weapons it wants on tap, including assistance with intelligence and so on. Can't defeat a small group of maybe 10, 15, 20,000 fighters armed with very basic, crude weapons, no heavy weapons to speak of, very limited technology and intelligence capabilities. And this ragtag force can't be defeated by some of the most sophisticated militaries on the planet. I mean, what this, of course, tells us, and I'll return to this a little later, is, of course, that you need a political solution, not a military solution. And you need a political solution that is consistent with the international legal rights of Palestinians. From the Israeli side, you often hear it's always the Palestinians' fault because they never accepted these amazing peace deals we offered them so many times in the past. Don't take it from me. Take it from Kofi Annan, who was involved in some of those peace processes, who has clearly said Palestinians have never been offered a deal which is consistent with their international legal rights. So every deal is essentially on the basis that Israel is giving or offering to give away things which it's not entitled to in the first place. Whereas the Palestinians are being forced to concede basic rights which are owed to them under international law. Now, this latest Trump proposal would have devastating ripple effects across the international system as well. So it's not just about the Middle East. Other predatory countries would be emboldened to seize territories that they covet, knowing it's no longer taboo. The US won't attempt with others to police the international rules. The president's plan is part of a broader strategy to dismantle international order and replace it with a unilateral, destructive America First agenda. Already, he withdrew the US from the World Health Organization, putting lives, including American lives, at risk. He's disengaged from the UN Human Rights Council, which is the body that appointed me. He ordered a review last week of US participation in and funding for all international organizations, including the United Nations, as well as a review of US participation in all international treaties the US is part of. He's just sanctioned the International Criminal Court for pursuing, as an independent court, impartial international justice, including in Israel and Palestine. And of course, he's igniting all kinds of illegal trade wars with some of the United States' closest traditional economic partners. It's no surprise that the president's announcement occurred soon after, well, when he met the Israeli Prime Minister in the United States, their fellow travelers in undermining international law, the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court. The Israeli Prime Minister, of course, is wanted by the court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So all of this, in a nutshell, is the US president seeking to essentially enable further Israeli lawlessness, which has deprived Palestinians of a free homeland for over 75 years. In all of this, of course, it's absolutely vital that countries who care about international law and human rights and the enforcement of humanitarian law to push back, to speak out against what the United States is doing. There are, of course, different ways of doing that. I mean, you can shout it from the rooftops and make public statements, and that is important to mark lines in the sand and to try to bolster and reinforce support for the international rules and to call out violators. But you can also do it privately through private bilateral discussions with the United States leadership. But you certainly shouldn't sit by and let it slide because you're afraid of the United States, you're afraid of retaliation if you speak out against them. Um, this week I was quite disturbed actually to see that only 79 countries, and I'm afraid to say it didn't include mine, Australia, only 79 countries signed on to a statement in support of the International Criminal Court in the face of United States sanctions against an international justice institution. That's only two-thirds of the states parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It's less than half of the international community. And I think the mistake in all of this is to think that, well, if you sit quietly, the US won't come for you, won't. I mean, the danger in that is it turns the international system into a system of individual countries turning inward and just looking out for themselves. It fundamentally undermines support for multilateralism and the norms of the international order, which our countries historically say that they have supported. But it won't protect you. I mean, we know that the United States doesn't particularly care under President Trump about traditional alliances, friendships, credit earned through fighting US wars alongside them. The US president will do what the US president believes, rightly or wrongly, often wrongly, I think, is in the national interest of the United States. And so if you think you can sit quietly and ride out the storm, I think you're gravely mistaken. What it requires is all countries to coordinate their response. Because if enough countries band together to push back, the United States can't easily take on everybody. We know that. But if there's this constant cycle of appeasement, whether it's on UNRWA or the Human Rights Council or the International Criminal Court or depopulating Gaza, that just emboldens somebody like President Trump to take more and more. This is what strongmen are. I mean, they only respond to strength. And if other countries are weak, then the president will take full advantage of that. Now, Siobhán, I'm not sure how long you want me to keep going. I'm happy to stop when you like. I'm happy to keep talking. Perhaps if you give me some indication, that would be useful.
Ben, what you're saying is fantastic. So keep going as long as you want to, as long as you, but when you feel uncomfortable, that's fine.
No worries, thanks. Okay, I'll go for a little bit longer, and then I want to leave time for questions and comments. So let me move now to say a little bit about the responsibilities of third states in relation to the conflict. One of the issues that we have advocated on quite strongly over the last year is the question of supply of weapons and munitions to Israel. I'm pleased to say that actually most countries who provided weapons to Israel have stopped doing so, have suspended arms and munitions transfers, direct transfers at least. And that's, of course, a positive development. The problem is, of course, in recent years, it's really two countries that have provided 99% of arms and munitions to Israel. And that is the United States, overwhelmingly providing about over 2/3, and Germany providing the remaining 1/3. And those are countries which have not stopped transfers to Israel. When we raise this with states, we use a number of arguments. One is, of course, the overriding responsibility under the Geneva Conventions, Common Article 1 of the four Geneva Conventions, a duty on all states to ensure respect for humanitarian law by the parties to any armed conflict. That includes conflicts you're not involved in yourself. And it's our argument that this is an obligation if you know that there's a real risk of another country using weapons to commit violations of humanitarian law, then it's within your power to ensure respect for humanitarian law by refraining from providing weapons or munitions. Now, this is an obligation like some other obligations I'll mention in relation to arms, which applies even if you don't intend your arms to be used by the other party to violate the law, or you're not certain that they will be used to violate the law, as long as there is a clear risk of it based on the behavior of the state to which you're transferring the weapons. Now, why I think this Common Article 1 provision is particularly important is because key states like the United States are not parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, which has clear treaty obligations applicable to arms transfers. And one of the in some ways problematic gaps in the Arms Trade Treaty, which I think has been well exposed by this conflict, is that the Arms Trade Treaty has obligations not to transfer in certain circumstances, and obligations of due diligence to assess transfers in certain circumstances. But it deals only with the transfer to the country. So it only deals with situations where the risk relates to the country to which you directly transfer the weapons. And one of the issues in the current conflict, I mean, take the F-35 fighter jet, for example. It's a consortium of countries. Different bits and pieces are made in different countries, and then are often shipped to, for example, the United States for the whole aircraft to be built. And then it's the United States that transfers the weapon to Israel. So my country, Australia, makes F-35 parts. Australia says, it complies with its arms trade treaty obligations because it's not shipping F-35 parts to Israel. It's shipping them to the United States. And unfortunately, the arms trade treaty was not really designed to cover the situation of onward transfers to a third country after the direct transfer, in this case, to the United States. Common Article 1, I think, addresses that problem because it's an obligation to ensure respect by the parties to any conflict. And that obviously means that if it's within your power to prevent those arms transfers, including by, for example, conditioning Australia's exports of F-35 parts to the US, on those completed aircraft not being sent to the United States. And if the United States doesn't agree to that, you don't ship the parts to the United States. That's an obligation which can be encompassed within Common Article 1. Now, like the Arms Trade Treaty and Common Article 1, it's not a prohibition on sending any weapon to Israel. I mean, if a certain weapon, because of its type or characteristics, is purely defensive and can't, of its nature, be used to commit violations of international humanitarian law, then conceivably you can continue to ship that weapon. I mean, a separate question is the political one, whether you just want to impose tougher weapons embargoes or sanctions on Israel, which is, any country's right to do, because you want to compel it to resume compliance with humanitarian law. We call these countermeasures in international law. It's fine for you to do that as well. But I'm thinking here, for example, of let's say a Patriot missile battery whose sole purpose is to stop incoming rockets hitting civilians in Israel. That's not a weapon which, by its nature, you can use to attack people in Gaza and kill civilians. The Arms Trade Treaty, many countries are now a part of. Articles 6 and 7 are the key provisions there. Article 6 requires countries not to transfer arms if they know they would be used to commit international crimes. So that's a pretty high threshold. It requires a high level of certainty as to the use of those weapons. But if you don't meet that threshold, Article 7 still kicks in, and that's a lower threshold, which says if there's an overriding risk the weapons could be used to commit or facilitate violations of humanitarian law, then you still have to refuse the transfer of those weapons. And that requires consideration of whether and how you could mitigate the risk, etc. But if you can't, then you can't transfer. One controversy that's arisen about the Arms Trade Treaty is the extent to which it governs the transfer of parts of weapons as opposed to whole weapons systems. It's clear on the one hand that Article 4 of the Convention requires states to, so the Convention applies to parts and components, but only where the export is in a form that provides the capability to assemble the arms as a whole weapons unit. The idea of this provision was obviously to stop countries evading obligations not to transfer weapons by saying, well, we're not sending the whole tank, we're just sending, parts of the tank in a whole bunch of unassembled boxes, and therefore, because the weapon's not ready to use on arrival, there's no obligation not to send it. Clearly, the convention, covers parts. The controversy is what does it mean for those parts and components to be in a form that provides capability to assemble them. A narrow view of the convention, and this partly this came up in the drafting, is to say, if you ship the parts of the weapon unassembled in the same shipment, then it's covered by the convention because you can put them together at the other end fairly easily. But the convention wasn't intended to cover, sending a box of armor 1 month, sending the tank turret 2 months later, sending the tracks a couple of weeks after that. So if they're, different batches of shipments, and this is frankly how a lot of weapon systems are transferred, then the convention wouldn't apply. I don't think that's a common sense reading of the convention. I know there was some support for that in the drafting, and it is a restrictive view taken by some. But if you look to the object and purpose of the convention, I think the better view is that any parts which can at some point be assembled into a complete weapon system must be covered by the arms export provisions. Just briefly, I'd also mention, the Genocide Convention, given that that's in play in Gaza. There's a duty to prevent genocide, so we also argue that obligation of prevention, which according to the International Court requires countries to do everything feasible within their power, particularly if they have special influence over the alleged perpetrator. That's an obligation which would require you, given your special influence as a weapons exporter, not to continue exporting if there is a risk of the commission of genocide in the use of those weapons. Individual state officials, of course, can be criminally liable for aiding and abetting war crimes through arms transfers. Although that is a high level, it does require knowledge that they would be used in the commission of international crimes. So it's more like Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty than Article 7. It narrows criminal liability somewhat. But look, as I said, there's still the possibility of sanctions on all weapons, full stop. And that's, of course, what a number of countries do in other contexts. I mean, if you think of the growth of so-called Magnitsky human rights sanctions around the world, my country and Europeans, Americans have these kinds of sanctions. If you want to stop human rights abusers, putting total arms embargoes on that state is a good way of doing that. That's, of course, discretionary, as opposed to the other provisions I mentioned, which are obligations. So let me just wrap up by saying something about humanitarian law. Over the last 16 months in Gaza and elsewhere, we have issued so many statements on alleged Israeli violations of humanitarian law. I've been doing humanitarian law for about 25 years, and it is slightly complicated in that humanitarian law applies often to the decision making about launching an attack. So you can't necessarily tell from the consequences of the attack whether it was illegal or not. It can be legal to potentially collaterally kill civilians and damage civilian property. The standard is, did you do everything feasible to verify that the target was military, not civilian, before launching the attack? Did you do everything feasible to refrain from launching the attack if the expected civilian casualties relative to the military advantage you anticipate would be excessive, i.e. disproportionate? Countries have never agreed to a rule that would require them to disclose the targeting information on which they base their attacks. This is a transparency problem because it means it is often very hard to know. I mean, when Israel has launched thousands and thousands of individual strikes, perhaps tens of thousands of individual strikes over the last 18 months, for most of those strikes, we will never know what was the intelligence Israel possessed, what were the steps Israel took to verify whether the target was civilian, military, what the civilian casualties expected would be. And so it does mean, unless you have whistleblowers, you are forced to rely on patterns of attack. Because just looking at a bomb site can only tell you so much. I think what we do know is that Israeli forces, certainly early on, were animated by a very strong spirit of vengeance. We know that very large, and this is a point made in the F-35 case before the Dutch Appeals Court last year. We know that Israel frequently used very large, high explosive munitions in densely populated urban areas, whose explosive characteristics, by definition, cannot be confined in an area like that to the military targets. And so inevitably you will have large civilian harm, people and property resulting. We know that Israel reportedly, at least, changed its interpretation of humanitarian law from previous conflicts, according to some reports, for example, to permit 20 civilians to be killed for even a single Hamas foot soldier. So not anyone particularly important, not a Hamas leader, but just a single person. Now, if that's true, that's off the charts in terms of the kinds of civilian harm calculus which any responsible military would tolerate. And as a result of that, we know that whole families and extended families of supposed Hamas fighters were obliterated in Gaza. It seems like Israel widened the definition of who is a Hamas fighter to draw in wider categories of supporters of the organization who weren't military fighters, who could be targeted under humanitarian law. We think that Israel has used artificial intelligence to draw up very large numbers of target lists in a very short space of time without adequate human control or supervision of those targeting processes. And that, look, the results of all of this, we've seen, most housing, public infrastructure destroyed, almost 90% of the population made homeless, well over 110,000 injured, tens of thousands permanently disfigured and mutilated, over 46,000 killed. The vast majority of civilian casualties are women and children. This has been the decimation of organized social life in Gaza, while the United States has continued to feed Israel weapons, and as importantly, to give political cover to it by saying, these kinds of frankly outrageous propaganda lines, which are always used by Israel, we're the most moral army in the world, we're the only democracy in the region, the International Criminal Court is biased and has it in for us. And the US and some other countries just parrot these kinds of lines as if they are gospel. It's not just the horror of the fighting; it's also other tactics. So it's the deliberate starvation of Gaza as a tactic of war, which is a war crime. The deliberate impeding of humanitarian relief, attacks and failure to take sufficient care for humanitarian relief workers, medical personnel, hospitals. Mass displacement multiple times of civilians under conditions which haven't ensured basic needs. Extensive arbitrary detention and torture and cruel and human degrading treatment in detention, not just in relation to Gaza, but also spreading in the operations in the West Bank. And then, of course, a story which hasn't been so much told is just a raft of laws in the Israeli parliament applicable in Israel proper, allowing all kinds of violations of human rights within Israel as well. These include, new offenses of incitement to terrorism and consumption of terrorist publications. wider revocation of citizenship, deportation of families of so-called terrorists, sacking teachers, revoking school funding, revoking allowances for children. I mean, this is a widespread pattern of human rights violations in Israel bubbling away as well. And you may have seen just this week a very famous bookshop in Jerusalem, the educational bookshop, which I was in just 2 years ago, was raided, and books that looked a bit Palestinian were taken off the shelves, and the owners were thrown in jail. Worldwide, we know that this kind of attack on freedom of expression has played out in many countries, including even universities. And I commend to you the report last year by my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Irene Khan, who wrote a report giving a very good overview of the range of restrictions on freedom of expression which have arisen in the context of the conflict in many countries. So look, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. And Siobhán, back to you, and pleased to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for that really powerful and insightful talk. It's impressive that you know so much and draw so much, and that you can talk without fading away. Thank you very much. The chat has been closed, but it will open now for people to be able to pose questions in the chat. Saman, our interpreter, cannot read the chat and interpret at the same time. So those of you who are listening in Arabic, could you please, if you want to put a question in the chat, could you Google translate it into English, because we can only read the chat in English. While people are putting the questions in the chat, I'll ask a question. The scenario that you've unfolded, both in Israel and in Palestine and globally, is almost overwhelming in just the scale of upheaval. Is a very mild word, but bigger than upheaval, kind of total destruction of the principles of human rights and international law that I think most of us grew up with, or those of us who studied it understood to be what people expected of the world. And I'm just wondering about Palestinians, the people in Palestine. When you see those pictures of destruction, it seems almost total destruction, and there'll be weapons and chemicals and unexploded munitions and no homes, presumably water and earth contaminated. It seems horrific, but what kind of hope is there for Palestinians? There must surely, if we give up hope, then it seems that we're almost abandoning Palestinians to just suffer what has happened to them. So there seems that we need to find some way to find hope for their right to self-determination, the right for justice for what has happened, also for people who have suffered in Israel as a result of violations there. I guess the right to memorialization of what's happened. And I just wondered, do you see any avenue or way forward to address that?
Thanks, Siobhán. And your question resonates with some in the chat as well about where do we go from here, given the lack of respect for dignity and international law. How do I see the future of international law, etc.? Look, you're absolutely right. I mean, Palestinians are traumatized on a vast scale, and there's a lot of trauma in Israel as well. At the same time, Palestinians are incredibly resilient. I mean, this is something they've been living with for generations, since 1948. and have kept fighting and have maintained their struggle in the face of extraordinary political and military pressure from some very powerful states. So I think the vitality of their struggle should give the rest of us hope and courage to keep fighting. I do think that it's not all a negative picture in the sense that a large number of states now have recognized Palestinian statehood. I mean, we're at 139 something. I mean, that was inconceivable 15 years ago. So there are, trends in the other direction. I think this conflict has given impetus to many states to shift their position towards hardening on the need for a two-state solution more urgently. So that all the violence of the current phase of the conflict is not wasted, right? If at least it can lead to some kind of renewed political impetus. I think there's been lots of organized legal pushback through the proceedings in the International Court of Justice of various kinds, many proceedings in national courts on arms transfers, the work of the International Criminal Court, the overwhelming majority of opinion in the General Assembly, even the Security Council demanding ceasefires. So I think internationally there is, broadly speaking, horror in most parts of the world at what is happening. The wild card, of course, is now President Trump, right? Because already under Biden, the US largely had Israel's back, no matter what it did. I mean, I think they paused some arms shipments for a very brief period, but that was it. There really were no red lines enforced by President Biden. But the game has absolutely changed under President Trump. That's why I say I think it is absolutely vital for coalitions of like-minded countries to step up. The EU needs to step up alongside all of the other blocs which have traditionally supported the Palestinian cause, because the United States cannot rule the world in the face of the rest of the world's opposition. It can if it picks off each state trying to do side deals for its own interests, right? And that was the problem I was referring to earlier. Either the world stands against these violations, or the violators, get away with what they're doing. I'm also encouraged, I'd say, by the huge groundswell of social organizing, protest, demonstrations in so many countries across the world. Now, that's part of what's led to this blowback on campuses and restriction of freedom of expression and a kind of new McCarthyism against people who question the Israeli orthodoxy in some countries. But it's nonetheless a hugely encouraging sign that there is this upswell for the Palestinian cause, because most people around the world, they see this for what it is. I mean, Israel has lost and squandered any of the sympathy really it had after October 7 because of the way it responded. Through such heavy violations of international law, through the dehumanization of Palestinians in the language used by Israeli leaders, through this gloves are off, vengeful approach to war fighting, to an acceptance of the starvation of civilians as a tactic of war. I think Israel lost that sympathy because of its massive overreaction. Now, this is something we've seen before. Of course, it's something that happened after 9/11. It's happened in other places confronting terrorist threats, and it's precisely why, to go back to my earlier point, the only solution is not a military one. The only solution is a political solution not just a free-for-all political negotiation where Israel and the US coerce weaker parties to get what they want, but a solution according to international legal principles, which upholds respect for self-determination over Palestinian territory, evacuation of the settlements, accountability and justice for violations of international law.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll go to the questions in the chat. And there's one there from Tosca, who thanks you very much for this interesting lecture. She says, as a large part of the weapons or parts of them arrive in Israel through the USA, and that USA is continuously lacking in getting out of its international obligations, what would actually be the foundation for their international responsibility in the future and the possibility to bring them to international justice, as they will never consent to have a case in front of the ICJ, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. And firstly, let me say, of course, international law in some ways has still relatively weak institutions and enforcement capacity. I mean, the Security Council is the ultimate enforcer. The US has a veto on that. International Court of Justice jurisdiction is voluntary. So if the US doesn't want to agree to be sued, it doesn't have to be sued. Advisory opinions of the International Court have assumed increasing importance, I think in part for that reason, because you can't get what we call contentious jurisdiction where states haven't agreed. But the advisory opinions, including the important one of July last year, become increasingly important for ruling on some of these issues, including the responsibility of third states not to recognize Israel's illegal annexation of Palestinian territory. So this was the opinion back in July. International law is still often enforceable through national courts. So there have been a number of proceedings brought in the US courts to challenge US conduct in relation to Israel, in particular arms transfers. But again, the governments can write the rules, change legislation. The US system is, look, the US is not a well-functioning, rule of law abiding democratic state anymore. I mean, that's clear that the US president can pardon whoever he likes for whatever reason he likes. He's been issuing executive orders which appear not to respect the rights of Congress or the Constitution in some ways. So, you can't rely on, in the US system, politicians pick the judges. You can't rely on US national law to enforce international law particularly well, or domestic law very well for that matter. So that, again, to go back to my point, it does make it all the more important for collective action to be taken by states coordinating their responses. Sanctions are a possibility. Countermeasures by refusing to deal with the United States in certain areas can, if enough states do that, can send powerful signals to the US to change its behavior. And this is what the US does all the time to other countries to try to compel them to respect international law in some ways. So there are some tools. There aren't enough of them, and they aren't strong enough. But we obviously can't give up. There's no other choice than to try to use the tools we have at our disposal, including the General Assembly, which has shown an important leadership role in this crisis by mobilizing international opinion in support of the rules in many of these areas.
Thank you. Moving to the next question, we have a few there from somebody, Thornton. What do you think, if any, the consequences might be for the Israeli PM?
Yeah, so consequences are both domestic and international. I mean, obviously he is embroiled in all kinds of legal and political controversies within Israel proper, including uh, strong arguments by the families of the hostages that the way he has conducted the campaign in Gaza has not been in the best interest of the Israeli hostages themselves. They've been calling for a ceasefire for a very long time, and Israel, did not agree to that for a long time. They've been calling for an independent inquiry into how October 7 happened, how, Israeli military defenses were so lax that they didn't see thousands of Hamas fighters about to cross the border and attack, and the Israeli government has refused to give them that inquiry. And under international law, where there's a violation of the right to life, as there was when many Israelis were killed on October 7, the state must undertake an independent, impartial, thorough inquiry to determine whether there were any failures in the obligation of the state to take preventive, protective measures to stop terrorist attacks being realized. He's facing corruption charges in the Israeli courts. The International Criminal Court obviously wants to get their hands on him. It's open to foreign domestic courts to conduct international crimes investigations as well, based on the principle of universal jurisdiction. When he's still in office, because of head of government immunity, it's not possible to arrest and prosecute a head of government. But certainly, as soon as he leaves office, he's fair game for foreign courts under universal jurisdiction. This is in part designed to deter. If enough countries show interest in investigating alleged war criminals like this, it can potentially have a deterrent effect if you'll never be able to travel to large parts of the world, like a lot of Europe and Africa, other countries that are concerned about these crimes. Ultimately, the obligation rests with the state party. Under the Geneva Conventions, the state itself must investigate and prosecute suspected war criminals. That includes, under the doctrine of command or superior responsibility, any military or civilian leader who orders or fails to prevent these crimes by subordinates as well. And unfortunately, the story of many decades in Israel, when Israeli forces have been accused of violating humanitarian law, the accountability system through the Israeli military justice process has just not led to the kinds of prosecutions, convictions, sentences that you would expect, given the number of allegations and their severity. So, Israel will always say we're a professional fighting force. We've got a military justice system, but it's if you look at the studies by Israeli and Palestinian NGOs, it's literally a couple of percent of allegations made by Palestinians ever lead to any kind of justice. And when it does lead to justice, it's often a mild disciplinary penalty, not a criminal conviction for murder, right? So this is, part of the problem we're seeing playing out in Gaza, the West Bank, and the neighborhood of the last 18 months is Israel has enjoyed almost complete impunity under domestic law and internationally because of its protection by the United States for so long that Israel knows it can get away with doing whatever it likes and there will be no consequences. And that, of course, needs to change if there is ever to be a lasting settlement of the dispute in Palestine.
Thank you.
Now, Siobhán, I'm afraid I have to take
go.
my kid to school in just a couple of minutes.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to have to sign off.
Yes, thank you very much. In answer to someone who's asking, yes, this will be recorded and the recording will be available. I want to thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Saul. That was such a powerful and informative presentation. Thank you. And thank you for answering the question so well. Thank you to everybody who's been listening here. And thank you to Saman Shabi for interpretation. And yeah, thank you. And have a good day.
My thanks. My thanks also. I couldn't see anybody, but I'm pleased to be with you, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. And I do want to raise a commendation for Ireland, of course, which has been a very powerful government supporting the Palestinian cause and international justice and international law over the last little while. And if we had more islands, we'd be in a much better world on this issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Yes, thank you, everybody.